Welcome to Middle Fingers Up, the show where we hold our heads high and our middle fingers higher. I'm your host, Kieran McKay. Today, I'm thrilled to reintroduce provisional psychologist Nevena Kalajdzic. This is her third appearance here on MFU, so we're really excited that she keeps coming back. And you guys might remember Nev from our previous engaging conversations, I would say. One of them was episode 21, where she and a colleague from Curio Counseling came on and talked about who would qualify for therapy. So that's a really good one. If you haven't listened to that, go back, listen to it. Lots of good strategies in that. And also she did a bonus holiday episode when we first came out, and that was sort of during the holiday times, just like how to build boundaries, how to be okay with saying no and not attending all the fuss the holiday seasons can bring. So another really, really good one. She's very good at helping, I find, this is maybe my personal opinion, but I would say very, very good at helping validate how to build boundaries and taking risks, and also encouraging asking for help. So I always appreciate conversations with Nevena. This is why I ask her to come back, because she's got a unique approach that I find sparks curiosity around how do we as individuals comprehend, sort of like how do we understand our daily interactions with our family members, people that we live with, people we work with. I also feel that through the sorts of thought-provoking questions that she often will ask, she encourages us to explore the reasons behind our actions. Like, why do we do the things we do? So very helpful in building insight. As well, I'm going to say one more thing. There's a lot of motivations, I feel, that drive the behaviors around us. And so I find in conversations with Nevena, another skill set that she's phenomenal at is helping folks figure out, why do I do the things I do and what are the reasons behind these behaviors? So I'm really looking forward to this one because I asked her to help me come on and unpack some of my own questions with my own family dynamics. And it's really interesting because I just got back from a family vacation. And so I feel like I have some fresh stuff or maybe some dirty laundry to unpack with Nevena. So welcome. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you coming back.
I'm back again. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. So, hey, I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you come back. You've provided some great resources with other guests that have come on. People always send really good feedback after our conversations because they appreciate how you simplify some of the things that we think make us crazy or some of the things that we do. And I think it's really helpful to be validated. And I'm not the only one that may be experiencing that. Even if I am the only one, maybe there's a way to sort of work around that. So there's always hope in conversations with you, which I really appreciate.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear. I appreciate that. Super high praise. I'm definitely not the only one that works this way, but I do appreciate
She's so humble. Word. So humble. Okay, so you're back. You're here. We're going to chat. We're going to talk about family dynamics. And so maybe before we do anything else, you can help me sort of explain, what am I talking about? What are we talking about when we say family dynamics? What does that mean? And there's a two-parted. And how do these family dynamics shape our lives?
Okay, the second one's a bigger question. So we'll start with the first one. So family dynamics, briefly, I would just say are the patterns of interactions between family members. So we tend to develop some patterned ways that we interact or engage with each other. And so sometimes those patterns collectively develop into a certain kind of dynamic. And when I say families, what I mean is families that really encompass a wide variety of different forms of families. Families these days can be quite complex. When I say families, I don't mean any particular form of family. Family could be a couple, could be a family of parents and children, could be multi-generational families that live together. Could be same-sex couples with children, adoptive families, blended families. There's lots of different kinds.
The list goes on. Families is more than just a mom and a dad and a couple of kids.
Absolutely. We're way past that. So it's 2023. But we understand that family dynamics and relational dynamics, we can even think of it that way, in
Yeah.
any interaction with other people, we sometimes develop certain ways that we do that.
Yes, don't we?
Mhm.
And so, okay, so before I start asking more questions, do you want to add to that before you go to part 2 of it? And how does that shape our lives?
Yeah, I would say it will probably cover a lot of how they shape our lives throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
There's going to be parts that we can see how there is an influence, often early experiences, early childhood experiences that we have in our parent-child relationships, in our sibling relationships, in our connections with other people in our community as we grow up. And so sometimes these dynamics and these ways that we relate to people carry through our life in different ways and influence our future relationships, our new relationships.
Yeah.
And so they have lots of different ways that they shape our interactions with the world.
Totally. Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's a nice way to start because I have a lot of things that I want to talk to you about. And part of why I want to talk about me and some of my dynamics is I think because I'm not the only one, I think people that listen are going to begrudgingly admit or openly accept, however you want to say it. Yeah, these are things that maybe we didn't even realize we do. We go back to with our parents, our siblings, our aunts, uncles, whoever.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when we realize these things, it's like, why do I do that? Especially, why do I do that when it really bothers me? I have all sorts of these questions, and I'm really glad you're here because I think there's a lot of people out there that probably feel the same, have those kinds of questions and thoughts as well about who am I in my family dynamics.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that you're always willing to be a bit of a guinea pig, if you will, or, drawing on your own experience. I just appreciate that there's some vulnerability here in you sharing about some of your personal examples, even as you do throughout your episodes, to really open up space for conversation. And I'm certain that there are going to be people out there who can relate to your experience or think of how maybe their experience is different and reflect on that. So thank you for doing that.
Aw, that's so sweet. I love this. See, I love talking to you. You make me want to talk more. Why don't we, before we get into this, because I feel like if we don't do the MFU segment now, we're going to forget because there's so many things as you see, so many questions I want to ask you.
Chatting.
What is on your mind? What do you want to put your middle fingers up to?
Well, right now we are dealing with a lot of wildfires in BC, and that's significantly affected some of my day-to-day thinking. Lately, I have family that lives in BC, and so my heart goes out to everybody that's dealing with wildfires, evacuations, and all the madness that comes with dealing with any natural disaster.
Yeah.
And certainly that's not the only place, even in Canada, let alone in the world. I just want to acknowledge how it's just such an awful thing to have to experience and live through. And when I think about relational patterns, I even think about the impact that natural disasters have in that context and how that influences us, our experience, trauma, grief and loss that we might go through when we might lose our home, lose people or pets, or go through all these different versions of losses or different kinds of losses. It's really devastating. So my middle fingers up goes to natural disasters as a whole, but in particular, wildfires in BC for me right now. And that's just a personal note.
Yeah, I appreciate you brought that up. I'm really glad because I think that's a topic that's on a lot of people's mind. Conversations I've had. I just came back from a vacation in BC. And so you see the smoke, you feel it, you smell it, let alone hear these stories of loved ones and family members or relatives of friends, right? And so I'm glad you brought it up. And I just have one question maybe that kind of came up. I also in these conversations am talking to people, like maybe someone like myself that am not directly impacted by it. Sometimes when you get watching news and social media and people's updates and videos, it can be a lot because there's a lot of info out there and people are sharing a lot of their grief out there. And so sometimes when you're not directly impacted, you can feel really helpless and not sure, I don't know what to do. And then we worry a lot because we don't have any control over what's happening.
For sure.
Is there anything that you could suggest or something that comes to mind if anyone is sort of in that place, like how to manage that or maybe pay attention to, like, am I okay when I'm really involved in watching the videos and getting into these conversations? And
yeah, it can be really overwhelming, right? The exposure to the news and social media, all the different things can be really overwhelming. So it's definitely always good, I think, to start with ourselves and checking in with where we are at and how it might be affecting us in that moment. Because really, we can only be effective in supporting others if we have a handle on kind of how we're doing.
Yeah.
And we have the capacity to support others.
Yeah.
So it's always good to start with ourselves, seeing how we're taking that in, if it's causing a lot of distress, what we might do that helps us when we're struggling, when we're experiencing distress, and then reaching out to those that we want to check in with and connect with, being there in whatever way that we can. I think that often will offer some relief.
Yeah.
We also have to consider there's certain things that we don't have control over. And then this is exercise in being able to tolerate some uncertainty. And it can really challenge us in different ways. And it can be really, really hard.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there's no perfect way to handle that. It's just, if we have hope and some support for each other and have some ways to connect, I think that can really make a significant difference, at least in how we're feeling and handling that.
That's well said. Well said. Okay. Well, I'm going to join you with one of my middle fingers because I have two, and say I'm going to join you because I really appreciate you brought that up, and I think you said that really well. I'm also going to add one with my other middle finger, my own MFU, and I'm going to put my middle fingers up to family vacations that can feel more like guilt trips.
Oh, look at you being all clever
I know,
today.
right? I was like, do you like that? I thought of that on my own. And maybe kind of what I mean, because I can sound really cryptic and vague, is sometimes, and this is sort of part of why we're here today, I feel when I say we, like I'm talking about me, but I say we because I feel like maybe there's other people out there and that helps me talk about it.
I'm sure there are.
But if I'm the only one, then that's fine. That's just me. But sometimes I feel like when we visit our family from childhood, so our childhood homes or our childhood communities or where we grew up, there's this one of the feelings that can come up can be this guilt due to some old feelings or interactions we've had with maybe people or the place that we lived at or were part of. And I feel like sometimes those old feelings can resurface, especially if there's unresolved feelings. So maybe I've had bad interactions with some cousins or family members or friends or whoever that I grew up with. And because we never resolved it, we didn't get to say, I'm sorry, or hey, I'm responsible, whatever that is. We haven't really fixed it.
Right.
And so then it's hard sometimes, I feel, to go back to some of those kinds of conversations or visit. And so then there's guilt because I'm also excited to see everyone and I love everyone so much. So that's why I feel middle fingers up to sometimes parts of these family vacations can start to feel a little stressful and a lot of guilt can start to come out. I'm not doing enough, not seeing people enough. Am I being present with everyone? Right. Did I say thank you enough? All those kinds of things also come up. So.
And you think it's related to some unfinished business.
Oh, look at this therapist coming out now. Hey, right? Maybe, yeah. Maybe, I don't know. I think this is a good point that you asked me this because there's always more than one way to look at something, right? And so I know there probably are, if you ask other people that question, they may have a different
perspective of that.
Totally.
Yeah.
For me, I would say yes to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unresolved stuff, and as a control freak who always has to feel like things have to go a certain way. And maybe that's oldest child syndrome. I think that's where some of that comes, right? Because I also understand if you and I have a fight and we never talk to each other again, I can still find peace without talking to you. I don't have to physically talk to you to resolve something. I understand that too. So maybe some of it is I myself haven't allowed myself to go back to some of those conversations and places as well and not resolved them or thought about them.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think it probably is related to some unresolved things. We don't always consider ways that our previous experiences impact us. But if we don't go through that process of reflecting on how some of that might be influencing the ways that we interact with the world or with people now, then it's a missed opportunity to realize that maybe we're carrying through some things from the past that aren't really serving us anymore, aren't helping us, maybe aren't the healthiest. But when we're familiar with something, it's a pretty easy thing to slip into. Yeah. We slip into these patterns because we know them, actually. So even when they're not the best or our favorite way of being, when it comes to familiarity, I think it's something that gets us sucked in.
Yeah.
Sometimes like unconsciously. So think about.
So I definitely had a wonderful time. And I just want to also point out, like, I am talking about my perspective, and that doesn't mean that's true, that this is my experience. So I just want to be mindful, because I know I have a lot of family that listens, and this is just me taking a risk.
Yeah. Talking about your own experience.
Yeah. That's all we can do, right? So
not taking away anybody else's voice in this.
No.
Right? Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. Yeah. So can we get into some of this stuff? Like, can we talk about a little bit about, you explain family dynamics really well, and how some of these patterns you talked about, you mentioned that word. So if my family and I are having these similar conversations on a regular basis, they turn into patterns, and they could be good things, like coming home after school and having a parent or grandparent or someone there that asks you how your day is, or something like that, where you get used to, and you then continue calling your mom on your way home from work and checking in. But then there's also these other patterns that I think we don't recognize, that maybe, as you mentioned too, like, aren't serving us, but we don't realize we keep falling back into. So that's sort of what we're going to talk about now is, okay, so I'm going to ask you a question. I'm a grown-ass woman.
Yeah.
And so,
yes, you are.
So some of these patterns you're talking about, these are things that happened when I was a kid. And I'm like 42-ish now.
Yeah.
So how would you say, how do the relationships and these interactions within a family during our childhood, how do they set the foundation for adult relationships? So how did these interactions when I was a kid set this boundary or this foundation for now how I interact with people as a kid? Like, how does that happen?
So the way that we grow up and form our family relationships in the context of parent-child relationships or sibling relationships, like I said earlier, they often lead to some ways that we interact with others later in life as well. So depending on our experiences that we have in our childhood, with our caregivers in particular, and this is sort of rooted in attachment theory, I just want to acknowledge that's one perspective that we understand how some of the way that people think and work, we can understand it through its connection to attachment theory.
Right.
So that's my perspective. So there's a bit of a bias there. But when I think about relationships, I think about the fact that if we had a safe, supportive environment growing up, it sets us up for being able to be secure adults who can connect with others in healthy ways and develop healthy patterns in different relationships, whether that's friendships, romantic relationships, their family relationships ongoing, obviously, as adults. But if we have some difficult experiences or negative experiences or challenging experiences in our childhood, and maybe have formed problematic patterns of interaction between, let's say, we take a parent-child as an example, and the fact that it's a kind of a problematic pattern emerges in that relationship, sometimes we then carry through those patterns in other relationships as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that whatever we're learning as children in our relationships and how we come to understand the world around us is likely to show up in some way, maybe not in every single relationship, but it's likely to show up in some way in some of our other relationships. And there's, like we said earlier about familiarity, when there's familiarity with something, even when it's not the thing that we prefer or maybe is the best or healthiest for us, when there's familiarity, sometimes we fall back into it, even subconsciously. So it is one of those things that it can have a really big impact. And it's important that we pay attention to our patterns, because then we can better understand why maybe we are having trouble in certain relationships in adult life.
Okay, can we break that down a little bit? So can we talk about an example?
Yeah, that would be great. It'll be easier to talk about.
Yeah,
if we have something to draw on.
Yeah, because you're talking about sort of the, like, in some ways, this is the influence of our upbringing. So how we were influenced as children, the things that we learned, things that we watched. So maybe people are not directly saying, hey, Karen, if you do this, but if I'm watching it happen, because kids are sponges, they take everything in. If mom and dad are having good conversations, mom and dad are having sad conversations, mom and dad are having too much fun, not, like, we we learn from all of these things as we grow up and, you know, play with our Barbies and all these sorts of things and have these relationships with Barbie and Ken and all these things. And then we grow up and we find ourselves looking for those kinds of things. Yeah. But sometimes we don't realize it. If, like, you hear about sometimes women in those domestic violence kind of relationships, they grow up witnessing it, maybe experiencing violence, and then find themselves in relationships and patterns maybe that aren't safe, and you know, or having people that yell at you. You kind of find ways to find those people to keep yelling at you, or new people to yell at you. It's weird to say, right? Because you just said sometimes you feel safe in those like pattern, even if it's a bad thing that you grew up with, being yelled at all your life. You kind of feel the most comfortable. You know who you are when you're being yelled at versus you're not used to it when you're not being yelled at.
Well, there's some familiarity that comes if we've had repeated interactions and formed this pattern of, let's say, yelling, and you've found a way to defend yourself and protect yourself in a sense through whatever behavior that looks like for you, then you learn to live that way. You learn to tolerate the yelling, or you learn to, you know, survive it. Yeah. And so sometimes when it's a very familiar thing, we learn to tolerate it. It's not distressing the same way. Yeah. And actually a different kind of pattern, like a calm way of communication, might actually be really uncomfortable for you. Right. Because if you don't know it, if you haven't experienced it, the unfamiliarity with calmness or a different kind of approach that's different from the one you already know might actually feel sort of unsafe. Yeah. So sometimes we find ways to reassure ourselves or find some sense of safety even in situations that maybe feel like chaos and really aren't the healthiest space, but it can be okay for us.
Yeah, like I have an example.
Yeah. Okay, let's hear it.
Okay, so here's my example. Okay, so it's a sibling, my sister and I, an interaction between my sister and I. So I'm the oldest, and a pattern that I've experienced as the oldest child is my upbringing. I was taught responsibility at a young age. I had younger siblings to care for. I had cousins. I really liked it because I thought that's how I got the pat on the back when I did good things like that. I took care of people and things. And then you relied on in that way to be, as you grow older, you're the oldest. So people look to you and you like that. And even if you don't like that, you're like, why aren't you looking to me? You know, because I'm used to, I'm the oldest. And I think I've seen all these meme TikToks about the oldest is like the manager of the family, and it's totally the man. And that was my job too. It's funny. Yeah. So it's funny because I have my sister, and she doesn't mind I talk about this example because it's funny. Like, she comes and visits us a few months ago here in Calgary, and like literally 5 hours of driving a billion hours with my dad and her 2 kids. And one of those 2 kids is puking the whole drive here. So like they literally just get here within 5 hours. Her and I get in a big fight. And my brother and his wife are kind of sitting there having to witness this fight. And the fight is so stupid, as it usually is. But it's about exactly what you're saying, my childhood influence. I grew up being the oldest. And so now I have this back and forth, this pattern of how the oldest is supposed to be. But she's almost 40 years old. Yeah. So I don't need to look after her and get angry at her about something she's doing that doesn't work, because I'm not her mom and I'm not the boss of her. She's the boss of herself. But I know that, but I don't know that when I'm talking to her, because I start talking to her as if I know better.
Yeah. And you're still taking care of her or parenting her maybe in some way.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what I'm doing. I'm parenting her and taking care of her. And that's not what she's looking for. And so we just get into this argument. And, you know, in the end, we apologize and, you know, we end up having a great time together. But I started thinking about that. And I know I've been doing it with her for years, but I don't know why that interaction in particular made me really go, ooh, like, why am I doing that? That's not, I want to have a great time with my sister. I love my sister. Why do I have to be so worried and controlling about the life choices? Like, who cares what she chose to do? And this, like, again, the situation was so stupid. Like, it didn't need to, it was so irrelevant for me to be like, but this is the way it's got to be. Right. So, like, is that kind of fitting to what we're talking about? This influence of growing up? And I know we talked a little bit about violence and stuff, but I thought, well, why don't I bring in an example of growing up and being in this place with my sister of I'm the oldest, so I'm the caretaker, and always being told that I have to take care of her and believing it and all that. And now we're grown women, and it's still there when we talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we often bicker because of that.
Right. Because you're probably doing a bit of like almost like a parent teenager interaction where you're trying to tell her something and you're trying to influence maybe some of her decision making or process or having some control, right? And she's resisting. She's fighting you on it because she maybe doesn't want to listen.
Totally.
She wants to do what she wants to do.
Yeah, as she should. And she's like almost 40 years old, right?
Right. But we actually slip into these very familiar ways of interacting with each other when we've done that for a long time. And there isn't necessarily blame to place for this. It's just that we do it in response to the way that our environment is and what the need is, right? So when you think about your experience of being the oldest sibling and having to take care of your younger siblings or cousins sometimes, you are often sort of invited into taking this extra responsibility. We might call that over responsibility even. So as you're taking on all of these things in terms of your responsibility and learning that, for the world to be safe, this is how you have to operate. For people to be taken care of and for you to be doing your quote unquote job when you're even as a young child, you might take on this over responsibility of, okay, I need to do this, and this to make sure that things are okay and things are safe. And a part of that means that you have to have some control. So sometimes we see a pattern in oldest siblings where you might also be a person who tends to be a bit controlling at times.
What?
And so there's a need for that because it creates a sense of safety, right? And so it's easy for you to go there. And then it's easy for those who get taken care of to fall into a pattern of being the person who's taken care of.
Oh my gosh.
And they will then invite you into, if you don't actually step into that all by yourself, which is very easy to do. Then I'm sure there's lots of opportunity where they invite you into it because of the way that they are. They might come to you and say, hey, can you help me with this? Even when they don't actually need that and could do it on their own potentially. But it's a familiar pattern.
Oh, 100%.
And so we go back to it, and it doesn't matter if we're 10 or 20 or 30 or 50, we're going to slip into some of that when it's such a familiar thing.
Totally. Yeah. Like adult children with their parents. There's things that parents have helped us with or bailed us out of. And so sometimes as adults, how many of us move back home? Like we need a break. We need to save up money or what. Like there's going back to even though I'm a grown up, I have my parent here that is willing to help me. I think we see that with addiction too. We see this enabling or this like, you think you're being polite and helpful because you don't know how to do anything, in any other way. And you want to be helpful, but it's enabling the habit or the bad thing. And it's kind of what you're saying about this pattern thing. It's back and forth. Like
enabling is one pattern, right?
Totally.
We could call it that.
Yeah,
enabling usually will then invite more of whatever is already happening,
right?
Because you are enabling it.
There you go, right? I heard you say when you were just going back and reflecting on my example as a child, you mentioned I was invited to this role of being the oldest child. That word was very interesting to use because I don't know how many of us would say I was invited to be the nosy older, like I'm just using my example of the oldest child. Like, and I always say I was taught this responsibility. But when you said invited, I thought, oh, that's really interesting because if you call me today, invite me over to your house for dinner, I have a choice to say no versus you calling me today and saying you have to come over to my house because that's what you have to do, and now I don't feel like I have an out. So it's very interesting that you use that. Is that why you use invited versus, because it's like a whole different way of looking at that.
It's a different word for it. It really comes from a place of that systemic therapy lens that I use, because when we think about like a family system and we think about these patterns of interactions, there are, we call them invitations. And this is just part of my learning and the experiences that I've had. It's particularly related to, I think, a systemic lens. It's the assumption that each behavior invites a response from the other person. And that response is another behavior. So it's an invitation to respond. And I think using that language allows us to feel empowered in how we respond to it. Because if we take it as I'm told to, that leaves us with no options because we are really expected to only do the one thing. So I call it an invitation, partly because of the way that I think about our relationships and the work that I do. in psychology, but it's an invitation to respond with a different behavior.
Yeah. I just really like that because it was a different way of looking at the example versus being like, but that's what happened. Because there's more siblings that came after me. I'm the oldest. And so you go to this logical place versus, oh, I actually have a choice. And what kind of older sibling in some ways that I want to be. I'm just having my own aha moment here. So I'm just going to put that away for a second and come back to that myself later.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe then we can move into breaking patterns, because you kind of mentioned patterns that go back and forth. We're talking about in overall family dynamics and how they impact us as adults. And in that, we talked about there is this influence in our childhood that we carry along with us as adults to our adult relationships. The kind of kid relationships we had with the adults in our life is going to somehow come up sometime in our life as adults. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes maybe it's not. And in this, you talked about how we go from kids having these interactions to it coming up as adults as we form these patterns. We go back and forth with certain way of, you yell at me, and then I yell back at you, and now I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be maybe with someone that I yell at. I'm going to have a kid and we're going to yell, that maybe I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about these patterns? Like, is this the way it is? If I grew up the way I did and now I'm older, I recognize a lot of things when I went home and saw interactions and mostly like in myself, things that I'm like, I wish I did that different. Oh, I wish I had said this. Oh, now that I think of it that way, right? So you have these aha moments after.
Good for you for doing all this reflecting and thinking about where you're at.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Sometimes it's just you want to be better, do better. And so when you start to realize these things, I think, okay, great. But now I come home and I'm like holding on to, I'm like, what the fuck do I do with all this? So can I do something with this? Can I break this? Is it a way to break patterns?
Absolutely. There are ways to change our patterns, right? Change is always possible. That's how I operate in my thinking. So we can make changes in the way that we think about the world and interact with other people and with the world around us. So it can be really difficult. I don't want to diminish that at all. I want to first say that making changes can be really hard.
Yeah.
Change can be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So when we think about changing patterns, then we're saying, okay, now I have to make a change, but also the other person or people in this dynamic, in this relationship might have to make changes.
Yeah.
And that's a lot to try to shift an entire system to be doing something different.
Yeah.
When maybe we've only done it this one way our whole lives.
Totally.
Let me give you an example.
Okay.
One of the ways that families sometimes learn to operate and to kind of get along is that they practice avoidance. So avoidance is one pattern that we tend to engage because we want to protect the other person's feelings. We don't want to stir up anything. We don't want to start a fight. There's lots of different reasons, right, for why avoidance can be a useful strategy in protecting our relationships.
Yeah.
However, ultimately, what it also can lead to is frustration, resentment, anger, fill in the blank of different feelings that come up when we don't get to address something that is bothering us, that's crossing a line for us, that we're not comfortable with. So we see this in a lot of families, or even outside of families, in relationships, might be in professional relationships, that you don't feel comfortable to go to somebody to say, hey, I wasn't okay with that, or this was really uncomfortable for me. But we're talking about families right now. And in families, we, I think, stretch that even further because we love our family members. We often try to have close relationships. We want to honor that. There's lots here to say about gender roles and age, the idea of we got to respect the elderly.
Yes.
So how much can you say, right? So when we slip into avoidance patterns, we can see how this ultimately isn't going to be helpful in our family dynamic. But when it's actually served us in protecting our relationships and maintaining our connection over time, for maybe years, it's worked, then we get kind of stuck in it. And so when it is no longer useful to us, we still might do the same thing over and over, but now we might see more frustration, more resentment, maybe more conflict, and it's ultimately going to affect our relationship negatively if we aren't able to adjust and change course. And that's where change comes in.
Okay, this was so well said because you said avoidance was a really good example of describing one kind of pattern in a family. And like you said, there's so many different dynamics, but that's a good one. And what I like about what you said here is those of us that maybe have practiced avoidance in our family, it served us, meaning maybe it helped us be safe, maybe the problem just wasn't that big. It was okay to just let it go.
It's tolerable.
Totally. But because of that, we were okay. We were able to, quote unquote, be okay, get through with that. But then something happens as we grow up and we become adults, and those things that we used to do to get through and to manage and not talk about the thing or whatever that is, we realize as we get older, that's not working anymore. And so I get what you're saying about change, but how do we start to realize that's not working? Can we just break that down for a second? Let's just use the example of avoidance. I think lots of reasons why you said we use avoidance. And one is we've never said anything because it was the best way to stay safe. A lot of people would probably say, well, then nothing happens. So then we just get in a big fight.
Yeah.
So there's no point of bringing it up.
Right.
And that worked because as a kid, you have less power. But now as a kid, you grow up and you're an adult. What do you do? How do you start to realize that's not working?
The first thing we're always going to have to go back to is that self-awareness. So we have to pay attention to our own responses and the way that certain behaviors from others invite us into responding a particular way. Okay. And when we tune into that and recognize it, then we can consider, is this the way that I want to continue to interact? Or do I want to do something different? And if I did something different, what would it be? And what kind of impact might it have? Because then it actually allows us to think about, if I do it this way, what else could that invite from the other person?
Okay, can I just add something here? What I like about what you're saying is an example that probably hits home for a lot of people is we all have someone in our family, our household, that we have stopped talking to. Something happened, we're mad at them, they're mad at us. Let's just go with we're mad at each other and we stop talking to each other. So when you talk about it in that way, I think there's a lot of people out there that would hold the position of, but why do I have to do something different? Because that person caused the problem. That person caused the pain. So I'm going to continue being super angry with them because they're the problem. They're the problem. How do I help myself realize by continuing to be that angry, I'm not getting anything out of it other than maybe becoming more and more unhealthy or whatever. And imagine anger does that to us over the years. It's exhausting. It's tiring. It's a really difficult place to continue to be. Is there a way to help any of us listening or people that we know that we can help with, even for me, around how do I detach from that? That's a really good
question. This could be answered in a lot of different ways. One way that I think about changes in relational patterns is that we also have to think about how much say we have or how much power we have in something, and really the fact that we only can make a change in our own behavior. We can try to influence other people's behaviors, but we can't actually do that for them. We can only change our behaviors. And so if you feel okay to tolerate the frustration or the upset or the anger that you have with that other person, and you feel okay to place blame in that space and don't want to make any changes, then you're going to just continue to have those interactions with that person the same as they maybe have always been or have been for a while. So a part of what I ask people to consider when they get stuck in some of those relationships where there's really a lot of conflict, a lot of resentment, and a lot of hurt feelings.
Like betrayal, injustice. Those are a couple of things that come up for me. And I would be in that place, right?
Those are hurt feelings, right? So underneath the anger, when we talk about anger, we also have to acknowledge that what's underneath it is actually what's driving this. And it's the hurt. When we're ready, if we're ready to talk about the hurt and address what maybe is bothering us in that pattern that we've established with that person, or maybe what it is that we need from them and what we want our relationship to look like, then we can try to shift towards a different kind of relationship and creating change. So again, it goes back to being willing to look at different perspectives and taking up new ways of interacting.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we understand the other person in a different way as well, if we can look at their behavior and think about how does this make sense for them?
Yeah.
When they behave this way, it's frustrating and upsetting for me, but how does it make sense for them? Then we also come to a new understanding, and it's, I think, a lot harder to be angry when we understand people. Sometimes we can have too much understanding.
So what I like about what you're saying about breaking patterns is you're talking about when many of us find ourselves repeating these negative patterns, you're talking about why does this happen? So recognizing why does this happen? And one of the examples you used was avoidance, because it's worked somewhere down the way. Now it's not working. So why was that working? Why does this happen? And now I'm recognizing, oh, this isn't working. And now you're talking about, okay, how can I sort of break from that? So can we get into a little bit of like what if I'm recognizing avoidance as a pattern I'm using in my family? And maybe before we talk about how do I break from that, are there other patterns that maybe, because I think that one hits home for a lot. Do you think there are other themes or patterns that you could sort of bring up?
Oh, there are endless patterns. We could talk about that forever. Because really you could think about patterns as being driven by our values, beliefs, our roles that we take up in the world, the expectations that we place on ourselves and on others. Those drive a lot of our behavior.
Yeah.
And so ultimately that's how we develop those patterns.
Yeah.
So through our values, morals, and beliefs, we develop different understandings of the world and how things are supposed to be. And then we are likely to act in a way that is a response to how we understand the world to be.
Totally.
So I know this sounds a little like complex or tangled up. So I'll try to use an example to paint the picture of this. And it's easy for me to go to traditional gender roles for this.
Okay.
So if we have grown up with an understanding that as a woman, you're responsible to behave in a certain way in a household, whether that's like caring for children or maybe it's cleaning and cooking. I'm really throwing it back now. I hope this is not how things are. Anyways, but we go into traditional gender roles. Then we act in ways that are consistent with that. And where we might get stuck in relationships is if the two people don't agree in what those roles are and what the expectations related to that are, and you're behaving inconsistently with that, then you're going to have maybe conflict around that.
Right.
This is why when we see couples come into therapy to work on their relationships, we sometimes will joke about the fact that we're talking about chores or things that seem quote unquote silly. That we get in fights about regularly.
Oh, yeah, man.
And it's about differences in expectations.
Yes.
And what we want to see of each other, what we need of each other sometimes. And so there's these breakdowns in communication that happen. So there are endless patterns that exist out there because I believe, we behave in ways that are consistent with the way that we understand the world and how things are supposed to be.
Totally. When you talk about that, this brings up an example from when I was on my family vacation / guilt trip. This is another interaction brought to you by Serena and Kieran, siblings. We were at a family gathering and the situation was kind of changing. Like my sister needed to leave earlier than it was planned. And so she had come to me and asked me for some help so that she could head out early. And I was sitting there with my husband and my cousin and his wife. And so my back is to them, but I'm talking to my sister. So they're watching this interaction. And so she's asking me, her plan's changing. She's got to go do something, all this stuff. And so immediately, she says, can you help me? And I immediately, I'm like, yes, okay, I got this. Yep, good, go. See you later sort of thing. And then I turned back around and my husband, Carrie's like, why would you pick that option when the way you chose to help, the thing that you agreed to do, and it was like driving my sister's car back? Why would you agree to do that option when that's not really, in his own way, being like, it's not really serving you right now, it's not helping you. The best option would be to just leave the car here overnight and deal with it the next day. But why are you rushing to do this? And then my husband looks to my cousin and his wife and he's like, am I out to lunch with this thing? And, both are like, no, I think you have a good point, Carrie. And so I really appreciated that too, because I was like, oh, I did not see it that way. And then so that interaction got me thinking, because to me, then I connected it to when my sister and I had the first fight a few months ago when she was here. It's, again, the role of my job, my role that I was invited to, take caretaker of the older sister. So my sister comes to me for problem solving. She doesn't realize that. I don't realize that. It just, of all the people.
It's interesting that she chose you, right?
Yes.
When there were probably 15 people at this party.
Yeah.
And there were other people who could maybe help, who could drive her vehicle. But she picked you. She came to you first.
Totally. And there was other options, like leave the friggin' vehicle, right? But I didn't even think of that because I was like, yes, I got you. Like, let's do this.
You're going to help out.
Totally. And sometimes
take care of it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna take care of it. But after that, I sort of like laughed about that because this was cute. This was these both examples are harmless. But the reason why they stick with me is because I'm doing something that isn't really working anymore for us. And when you talk about the couple that walks in and they're bickering over chores, it just made me think of my sibling and, my sister and I, and that we bicker over these things because these things used to work for us back in the day. And now we're falling back into that trap and we're recognizing, okay, our relationship's changing as grown up sisters.
Well, circumstances change and people change, right?
Yeah.
So we grow up and we change as people and what our preferences are, what we're comfortable with, where our boundaries are. And really, a part of what we're talking about here are our boundaries. Because when we're able to set boundaries and continue to evolve them as we change, then we can have clearer communication with others and feel connected and stay connected.
Yeah.
Because they know where we're at and where our limits are.
Totally. Yeah.
And if we don't consider what's changed, either within us or around us, then we're going to continue to do the same thing again. Well,
so that's just it. Because in that conversation, when, the three of them ganged up on me, no, I'm kidding. When the three of them sort of helped me realize why did we go with that? Carrie's like, what are you going to do now? Because you really shouldn't be driving the car, at this point. And so I was like, so I calmed it. I was like, no, I can't say no to her. I already said yes now. I got to stay this course. I'm letting her down, whatever. And I'm like, no, so he's like, you got to figure this out. I say, okay, I'll go back and tell her. And so I go back and see her inside and I say, listen, I wanted to help but I'm not in a place to help right now. And so let's think of other options or whatever.
Yeah.
But I can't do this. And she was great. She's like, of course, that's great. Totally get it. Love you. Peace out. Bye. It was me that kept thinking, well, I can't because she's not going to, I'm protecting her.
Right.
It's going to upset her more. That's not at all what happened.
Right.
So it's interesting because it's hard sometimes to say no when you're used to going back and forth.
Absolutely. My supervisor, Tamara Wilson, would say that we're having trouble exercising our no muscles.
Yeah, that's so cute.
That. Yeah, it's like it is a muscle. And if we don't exercise it, it's not going to be very strong. And we're really going to struggle with saying no.
Shoot.
And this could be a whole other conversation then about our need to please others and be liked by others. And that's a whole
different topic, right?
That's a whole other episode.
Looks like you'll be coming for episodes now. We're counting 4 and 5 now. So that's 5 times right there.
Topics.
I like that. That's cute. We gotta do some, no, leg day's always hard, but now no day is gonna be even harder in the gym.
That's right.
Let's go exercise our nose.
Yeah, we have to strengthen our ability to set limits and boundaries, because ultimately to have healthy relationships and strong relationships, those things need to be honored. We need to learn and express to one another what it is that we need from each other and how to have a relationship that's thriving.
Yeah.
Rather than falling into patterns that maybe used to work for us, but no longer do. And then that can be distancing and disconnecting.
Right.
And then that's when we pull back. And the lack of communication or that avoidance that we talked about earlier ends up pulling us away from that person because maybe we don't all want to have that conversation. It's easier not to. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Yeah.
But now you haven't talked to them in 6 months or haven't seen them in 6 months.
That's right.
Because you're like, oh no, I don't want to do that again. That was so uncomfortable. Okay, but if you actually expressed it to them, and I know this is stretching it now because we're talking about new practices, but if you're willing to start a conversation about it, then that person might be able to do something about, okay, well, how do we make this different? How do we do this differently? Because I miss you and I'd love to see you and I'd love to spend time with you. Yeah. And I'm sorry that we're in this place where we can't connect.
You did that with me years ago.
It's true.
My respect for you went up like 100 billion. You know that activity at the fair where you hit the hammer and it goes
And it
bing
goes
and it goes
all
all
the
the way? My respect for you went bing all the way because you and I had a bad interaction, and my experience is usually I hold grudges, and grudges sometimes can mean really just like not talking to you anymore. Like I'm done with this and not going back and repairing things.
Yeah,
and that's
you write people off.
Totally.
And that's worked for you historically.
100% it has. And you avoid all these things. And so, but you did the opposite. You reached out and you invited me to coffee.
Yeah.
And we went to coffee and we had a really good, and I was so uncomfortable. I was so scared. I was like, I don't want to fucking do it. It's easier to be mad and just not talk to you. But the thing, you know, like I think recognizing, because that conversation went really well, and here we are thriving as, you know, friendships and all this. But I think the interesting thing about that and recognizing when you did that and you role modeled that was maybe, let's say, in our relationship, we didn't need to talk to each other anymore. I'm fine, but I'm going to keep doing that. Like it's been continuing in my life. So being in a place where we could break that, and you helped me do something different by talk about it, which now helped me start to go back to things more, and with kids as well, like going back and apologizing. Let's go back. And that's sort of what we talked about at the beginning was it's important for me to go back and resolve things. Go back. Unfinished business is hard for me. Right. So it's interesting, you know, with example with you there where you were great for that.
And that's an example of repair, right?
Yes.
When you say that, I think about repair.
Yes.
And looking at ways to reconnect.
Yeah.
To reestablish that bond, to look at what do we need from each other now, right? That's different. If trust is broken, if there's hard feelings around something, if there's hurt, it can be acknowledged, it can be talked about, it can be validated, and there's something there too about forgiveness, right? That we can honor. There's lots of pieces there that people sometimes need to feel that they can repair their relationships. There's, again, no one right way to do that. But one of the things that I did was I had learned a process of repair in my relationships, and you were somebody who I cared about and wanted to repair my relationship with.
Right.
And so you were in a different place because you had maybe had a relationship in the past that you've been able to let go and kind of, I don't know if it's okay to call it like write people off.
Totally.
Right?
100%.
Like,
call it what it is, man.
I'm done with you. Right.
Yeah.
And
I think the term was "you're dead to me." That was sort of the kind of term that was
the theme?
That we would connect with that. Exactly. Yeah. Like we're just done. That's it. It's over. See you later.
And for me, I could have gone along with that.
Totally.
And we would have both just avoided and we would have no relationship potentially.
Yeah.
But I wanted to do something different. And so by inviting you to coffee and actually having a conversation about what's happened, I invited you into the repair process that you were willing to respond to. And this is how we started maybe a new kind of pattern.
Totally.
Right. And it was a new interaction. It was a new experience for you.
Right.
And in a sense, maybe for me too, I can't think of other examples right now.
Yeah.
But maybe I had a little more practice with it. So I was able to bring something different to our particular relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that because sometimes it takes patterns are formed with more than one. You got to have another person at least to be part of a pattern. I mean, I guess you could you can have your own patterns, but in this case, with family dynamics, I think sometimes that's a really good point where maybe one person isn't in that place or that's not like them. It's helpful to have different members that's their specialty, that's their strength, where we can go back and resolve this or fix this or have this conversation. And I think that's really healthy personally, just as I'm getting older and my kids are getting older. Feels more peaceful to have less people on your hit list.
Yeah.
You know, and crumple it up and say there is no such thing. We don't need that in this world. And I got to let things go. If I don't want to make amends or go back and fix some things with people, then I have to also be okay with letting that be where it is. But also I think focusing on maybe more follow-ups than not, because it can be helpful, like even going back and having that conversation with my sister. And even when we worked out after the 5-hour fight, you know, like there's less time in between these bad interactions where, you know, you can go days, months, like you said. And for me, that is my thing. So how can I,
we get better at it.
Totally.
Right? With practice. just like saying no.
Yeah.
With practice, we can also get better at repair. We can get better at acknowledging. We can get better at listening.
Yeah.
These are all skills that we're not born with.
Yeah.
So we really need to exercise them.
Yeah.
These are all different muscles that we can use in our relationships with others, right?
Yeah.
If I'm bad at listening, there's not going to be a lot of people who feel that they can share with me or connect with me.
Yeah.
So if I improve my listening skills, that might invite more sharing and more connection like that. Yeah. So again, that's another example of maybe a pattern that we can exercise, and different practices, different ways that we behave that invite a different kind of response from people around us.
And the other thing I really like what you're talking about is it's sharing the load. So sometimes we don't do the fixing. I keep saying fixing, but I mean like the reaching out, trying to reconnect, trying to find some kind of way to break this pattern that's not working. Mm-hmm. And what I liked about what you're saying is when we reach out and try to talk to maybe the person that's involved in it, or maybe with someone else for help, we're sharing the load. Like sometimes we think it's not possible to do. Like I would have never called you because that would have been way too much for me to do.
Yeah.
But when you called me and I went, it really felt like we were both finding a way to share the responsibility and move forward, versus sometimes I think as individuals, we think, oh, that's too much for me to take on. But we learn when we connect with other people and talk to people, oh, I don't have to do this all by myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
And sometimes that other person might not want to engage in the repair process. They might still be in a different place. And sometimes we have to do repair and healing independently.
Okay. Right? Talk about that. Yes.
Because there are times where we won't get the apology or we won't get the acknowledgement. Like I think about people who come into therapy and they're having to go through that process maybe in therapy because let's say they've had a history of being physically abused as children by their parents, that those parents, their perspective might be that they were doing the best that they could and parented in a way that was appropriate at that time. And so they have no reason to apologize. They don't see why it would be important or how that might have been harmful, or because it was just the way that it was.
Right. Yeah.
And so again, going back to our understanding of the world, if we understand the world in a certain way, then we will act a certain way too.
Yeah.
And if we're never going to get that apology now, this person's coming to therapy and saying, you know, I have this history of pretty significant abuse, but my parents don't see it that way. And they would never acknowledge it or apologize because that would hurt them, because ultimately they never had bad intentions. They really just tried to do their best. Then this person now has to do some of their own healing around it, and knowing that the apology won't come. So what else do I need? And how do I now see this differently? Respond to it differently? What kind of relationship do I want to have with my parents now?
Yeah.
How do I want to look at them? Are they bad parents because they did it this way?
Yeah.
Or can I take some other perspective in a way that's going to allow me to stay connected to them? Because if you see them as bad parents, there's going to be certain things in your mind that go along with that. And you're going to interact with them a certain way because you think they're bad parents.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I like how you said that. I think children of immigrant parents are listening right now, let alone other just children of, having parents. But definitely for those that come from that world where discipline in particular is very different in North America than when people that immigrate, let's say from India, Africa, other parts of the world come here. Parents have to learn this the hard way. Russell Peters has that funny little bit about kids saying, I'm going to call children's services, and the parent's like, let me dial the number for you, versus a white parent saying, oh, hold on a second. It's just a funny joke in terms, that's just the way it is. It's discipline. But, Jen Hoy, who you're a therapist you're familiar with, she does a lot of trauma therapy, and an episode with her, we talked about exactly what you're saying, which is how do you heal your bad experiences without the people that were involved in it and still thrive with those people. And these dynamics are a big part of our story.
Yeah.
Right? And our story's still being written as we continue. So I think we can, like you said, change it, have a sequel to the book. And that's what I'm doing nowadays. I'm just writing the sequel, right? And sometimes you need to write the prequel. I really like how you're talking about how to break some of those patterns and some of those ways that we're doing it individually. Yeah. So for those who have experienced challenging family dynamics, how can therapy or counseling play a role in healing and maybe even personal growth?
Well, I'm biased in this.
Yeah, well, I'm asking a therapist, yeah.
I think therapy can be helpful in a lot of different ways. Not for everybody and not at, any one time, but...
Okay, but we always say we're so gentle with, oh, but therapy may not be for everyone. How can talking to someone not be for everyone?
That is a very
How can getting
good
something
question.
painful out of your head and out of your body not be good for everyone? You guys are so kind and so open to you guys are accepting of maybe you're not ready. And I get that too. And I support that. But any one of us that thinks about no, we're a balloon that's just filling and filling and filling through life. And at some point we're going to pop. That's what happens.
If we don't let it out, it's true.
We will pop.
There's just a part there. I guess the reason I say it that way is because I think about readiness. If we're not ready and if we're really uncomfortable with this idea of going to therapy and talking to somebody, then it might not be for us right then.
Yeah. Fair.
But, talking to people is important. And I think that just goes back to connection. So if you have family members or close friends that you feel comfortable talking to and opening up to get support, to consider different perspectives, to learn about yourself, sure, do it that way.
But I'll be honest with you, we all have these loved ones and great friends and family. And I have so many, you included, that I have been able to share things with that are really, really private. But I'll be honest with you, and I know I'm not the only one, there are many more things in my mind that I choose not to share with loved ones out of protecting them, out of I'm supposed to keep this shit together. Are they going to think I'm not the older child that, but a therapist, someone that I don't know, I have never found anyone else that I can open up in the way with someone that I don't know. And that's the thing that I think, I really encourage people to think about, because we're not always as honest about some of them when we're like, I'm fine, I'm okay, this is great. But when therapists sit down with us, they have, what's in it for them? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're just going to ask the questions that can start to get that out. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out because, and I have a great relationship with my husband, all these people that I can talk to. But man, there are things in therapy that you don't have to protect anyone in therapy. That's the thing. You can even start protecting yourself, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Hopefully you feel safe enough to let your guard down and actually be vulnerable, right? Yeah. That's how we would want as therapists. We do best, I think, with those clients who are ready to put their shields down and their walls down, or whatever analogy you want to use. Yeah, whatever
superhero analogy we want.
That's right. And to be open to considering what's going on in your life, how you might want things to be, whether the way that you live your life is aligned with your values, and whether you want to make some changes, right? Yeah. So there's lots, I think, in terms of therapy and your question about how...
I like how I asked you and answered for you, but I'm going to let you finish.
Go back to,
Total Kanye Taylor moment here.
I think it just goes back to what we were saying earlier, that sometimes resolving certain things and learning new ways can happen in therapy if you don't have the opportunity to do the repair process or make some of those changes with the person maybe that you had trouble with or you got stuck with. So sometimes that's where therapy comes in handy. We can do some of that work independently and find new ways and think about change and growth for ourselves. And then maybe that translates and kind of trickles into our relationships in a different way.
Thank you for that one. Okay. I want to keep you forever, but I know if I don't keep you forever, you'll come back more. So
we always have lots to talk about.
Right, we do. So is there anything that, I know I asked for your help and we were planning, and so anything that you remember that we talked about that we didn't bring up, or anything you wish we had brought up that we didn't?
I think I just want to invite people to be compassionate with themselves in recognizing some of the patterns that we engage in or slip into sometimes. We tend to also connect it to blame or blaming, whether it's blaming ourselves or blaming others. And I see this a lot with clients in the conversations.
Also, she just looked right at me when she said clients. So clients / friends, I guess. But
Yeah, that's the blaming or the guilt that comes with it. It can be really difficult because we beat ourselves up over certain interactions. We all have those moments where we finish talking to somebody and then we're like, why did I say that? Why did I do that? What happened there? Why did I get so upset about that? Right. And so
I can be so kind to a neighbor or a friend about something outrageous they brought up. But when my family members said, right, like we can maybe the compassion also needs to be there for our family members too. Cause I feel like we can be so much more compassionate about people outside of our family. Like it's harder
Sometimes
to
we
do that
stretch
sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just holding that compassion for ourselves. And as I always say, going back to being curious about why that comes up, how did it come up? What happened there? If we can engage in some process of reflecting on our experience and looking at what do we want to do differently, then that gives us some opportunity for change and for things to be different for us. Yeah. But I also want to acknowledge that sometimes these situations are really complex. They can be really difficult. They can be dangerous. So, and when we talk about patterns, we're talking about some of those day-to-day patterns that we often see in, like we talk about sibling bickering and parent-child, resisting and temper tantrums. Yeah. And so I just want to acknowledge the fact that this isn't like an all-encompassing conversation around patterns and how we challenge those things, because there are certain situations that pose serious risk and patterns that we get entrenched in that can be really, really even life-threatening. And so I don't want to diminish that and just acknowledge that, this isn't, we're not focusing on that today. And we're talking about how challenging things that happen on a family trip can lead to some frustrations, and we notice like, oh, what happened here? And so it's just helpful to look at that and look at what do I want to do different
here? Because I want the interactions in my mind, like I want them to be good. I want them to be fun. I want my kids to be part of that. So that's why for me, these things come up. It's not to pick at anyone. It's actually like, we talked about a lot. You mentioned self-awareness, like, okay, what can I do better? How can I be better? Because sometimes I think as individuals, like we all grow up together, and this includes our parents too, but everybody grows. And so when we go into different households, we don't get to be part of each other's growth. So when we come back together, we just assume that maybe that sibling still thinks the way they do, or maybe your dad still does that thing. And sometimes, like, even for me, I have to check myself and be like, just because that's how we were when we were kids doesn't mean that my sister still needs me to take care of her in that way.
In the exact same way. Exactly.
Right. So it's, see, talking to you today helped me come to that place. So thank you for that. Okay, call to action. If our listeners are going to take one thing and only one thing from today, what would you hope that would be?
Maybe this is a bit of a different one, but I would invite people to play detectives a little bit in what some of their own patterns might be in some of their close relationships. Ooh. So maybe this is more of an exercise than I guess it's a call to action still. But
it's a great one.
So what I'm really inviting is for people to consider noticing when frustrations come up repeatedly in the same interactions with the same people, to look at that and wonder, be curious about that and wonder why it is that it plays out that way. When we slip into these familiar patterns, like we said earlier, sometimes it's so habitual that we might not even notice it. It gets away from us really, really quickly. So I would encourage people to maybe do a little exercise on, let me try to slow this down and really pay attention and play detective on what happens when I do it differently, when I respond to it differently, or even just noticing, like, how did I get there? What was the thing that got me upset? And then that gives you some insight into, do I like this? Do I not like this? Yeah. Do I want this to be the same or different? Yeah. How is this helping me or not helping me? Am I doing something that I could be doing differently that would make this relationship better, or that I would make our communication better? There's lots of different ways that we can navigate that. So it's just a little fun thing to do.
I like that.
Yeah.
I really like those questions because they're lovely questions to build what you've been talking about, self-awareness. Lovely questions to ask ourselves to help us figure out the things that sometimes we struggle with figuring out. So thank you for that. I would love for folks to send us what they're getting out of being their own detectives. What are the things they're discovering and finding? Are they solving some mysteries, cases closed? Like, what's happening? Open file, what's happening? So please send that our way. That'd be awesome. I also want to note, if you are interested in reaching out to Nevena and pursuing a consultation or therapy, you can find her on Psychology Today. Must be from Alberta in order to be a client, right? And receive therapy through your practice.
Yes, that's right. It would have to be people in Alberta, but absolutely, Psychology Today or curiocounseling.ca would be the best place to find me.
Perfect. Awesome. I love that. Okay. And you brought affirmations today.
I did bring affirmations.
So
and this one.
Do you know I started that tradition with the affirmation cards you gave me? And it's funny because we'd be doing it right now, but you brought different ones. So let's do this. These are the folks we love, aren't they?
I brought these ones. So these are from...
They're our favorite people because this is a different set, right?
So the company's called Knock Knock, and their website is knockknockstuff.com. And they have these fun affirmators cards, and they have different versions of them. So this one is called Affirmators Family, and it's 50 affirmation cards to help you help yourself without the self-helpiness.
So I just want to note our little ritual.
Mm-hmm.
It's some things that shape us as kids. We have rituals and traditions and things, and we also appreciate them as adults. And so you and I work out together during the week, and often after a workout, we hit up one of the affirmations and you fan them out, like pick a card, any card. And it's cute because we read them out and talk about what stands out for us or how we may relate to that or how we see that in the other. So I love that you brought these today.
I love these. You know that. So
yeah, I do know that.
I'm fanning them out right now so you can pick out one of these family affirmations.
You use these with clients too, don't you?
Sometimes I do, yeah. Some people really like these. You know, not everybody's a fan of affirmations, but...
Okay, I'm just picking mine out here.
Okay, well...
Oh, I got two!
I think you grabbed two, yeah.
I did. Oh, and one was a bonus card. So sometimes they throw bonus cards in here.
Perfect.
And the rule with a bonus card is you get to pick an extra one. So it just happened for me naturally.
You just are natural.
So do we get to read these out? I love it. They have you guys have to check these guys out because they have the cutest little drawings and the way they write is literally how I think. So I love it. So do I get to go first or you get to go? You're the guest. You get to go first.
You want me to read mine first?
Yeah. You always make me go.
Okay. So mine is called Consolation. And the affirmation says, I'm a kind and supportive family member, and I give that support as willingly as a golden retriever. When someone I care about is feeling down, I'll console them and pick them back up. Not literally, unless they're much, much smaller than me. But even in that case, I'll remember to lift with my legs because kind and supportive people aren't immune to back issues.
Ooh, look at that. It's like a workout tip too. Okay, so you're going to laugh at mine. The bonus card is reprieve.
Okay.
And so when they say reprieve, they say every family has a person who takes on more than their fair share of the collective burden. Does this sound like you? Have you been through a gauntlet of physical or emotional chores only to come out feeling like you have nothing left in the mental mop bucket? Consider this a permission slip to take a break. The world won't stop spinning if you take a minute for yourself, and your family won't fall apart if you act like a human instead of a superhero. Even Superman had a fortress of solitude. If he hadn't, we certainly would have found him crying on the bathroom floor. Can you imagine Superman just like in the fetal position in his little tight suit with his cape?
Hey, we all need breaks.
We do. Okay, I have one more. So we get to read honesty. Okay, ready? So because I got an extra one, I get to read this one. It's called Honesty. I communicate honestly with the people in my life, even when that means initiating hard conversations. Oh man, I don't want to keep reading this.
Wow, this is like exactly what we were talking. Well, not exactly. This is totally some of what we were talking about today.
Right? It's not super comfortable to dredge up old resentments, but better to clear the air now than to let them fester into even older ones. Oh my God. Besides, they really do not need to learn. That's not the way the toilet paper roll should face. Like, these are amazing. I love these. Thank you for bringing these.
What a perfect way to capture some of what we were talking about today.
I agree. So cute. This is awesome. So I'm glad we did this. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate this talk.
Thank you for having me again. It's always so much fun, and I love unpacking little examples, and hopefully people have some fun takeaways from this.
I agree.
Good takeaways.
If not, I'm selfish. I had a lot of takeaways, so that's what matters, right?
Not so bad.